court fell silent. Very few people had Eala advancing deep into the tournament. Most predictions placed her in the category of promising young talent, capable of winning a match or two before quietly exiting and disappearing from the headlines before the second week even began. That was the script almost everyone expected. Eala had no intention of following it. She grew up in a country where tennis talent often developed faster than the facilities available to support it. Some of the courts where she trained served multiple sports, and opportunities rarely came as easily as they did in traditional tennis nations. Yet those challenges built the resilience that would eventually carry her onto the sport's biggest stage. When she finally walked onto the pristine grass of Wimbledon, nobody knew how a young player carrying that kind of pressure would respond. They were about to find out. Her first major obstacle was not an unseeded outsider. It was Iga Swiatek, the defending Wimbledon champion and one of the most dominant players in the world. A champion known not merely for defeating opponents, but for dismantling them with relentless precision. For the opening set and much of the second, the match unfolded exactly as many had expected. The favorite appeared firmly in control. Then something changed. It happened so quietly that even experienced commentators almost missed it. Watch Eala during those crucial games. Her eyes never wandered toward the crowd. They never searched the scoreboard. They remained fixed on the baseline, completely absorbed in the next point. It was a subtle detail, but it revealed everything about her mindset. Her swings became more confident. Her movement grew sharper. She started taking the ball earlier, dictating rallies instead of reacting to them. There was no dramatic celebration or emotional outburst, just steady, relentless improvement, 1 point at a time, until the wall everyone expected her to hit simply disappeared. Then came the final point. Swiatek's last return drifted beyond the baseline. For a brief moment, center court froze. No applause. No cheers. Just complete silence, as thousands of spectators processed what they had just witnessed. Then the stadium erupted. The cheers rolled through the stands with a force that seemed to shake the entire arena. In that instant, everyone understood they had witnessed something far greater than a routine upset. They had watched one of the defining moments of the tournament. By the following morning, this was no longer just another tennis result. It dominated headlines across the Philippines. Fans set alarms before sunrise, families gathered around televisions, and countless people replayed the highlights over and over, unable to believe what they had just seen. Eala was no longer simply an emerging talent. She had become the story the entire tennis world was talking about. Catch the highlights before their workdays even began. Students had exams waiting in the morning, yet sleep suddenly became optional. Across the Philippines and among Filipino communities around the world, alarms rang hours before sunrise. Nobody wanted to miss a single moment of Eala's remarkable run. By every traditional sports script, this is where the story should have ended. One unforgettable upset. A few days of headlines. A wave of celebration. Then reality returns in the next round, just as it usually does. Except reality had different plans. Standing between Eala and another historic milestone was Jasmine Paolini, one of the finest grass court players remaining in the tournament. A Wimbledon finalist only 2 years earlier, Paolini understood the surface as well as almost anyone left in the draw. Her game was perfectly suited to grass, quick, aggressive, and relentlessly efficient. While many players simply adapted to the surface, Paolini looked as though she had been built for it. There was another layer to the matchup. History. Not the kind that dominates headlines, but the kind professional athletes never truly forget. Months earlier in Dubai, Eala had produced one of the biggest victories of her young career by defeating Paolini in convincing fashion. It wasn't merely a win, it was a statement. Paolini had quietly carried that defeat with her ever since, waiting for another opportunity to respond. Wimbledon provided exactly that stage. Suddenly, this was no longer simply an inspiring underdog story. It had become unfinished business. As both players walked onto center court, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. The crowd wasn't settling into their seats with quiet anticipation. They were already fully invested before the first ball had even been struck. The cheers arrived early, louder than expected, carrying the unmistakable feeling that thousands of spectators believed they were about to witness another historic chapter. That kind of belief changes a stadium. You can feel it before the opening serve. Eala glanced toward the stands, where Philippine flags waved proudly from sections that had been empty of them only a week earlier. Paulini, meanwhile, never looked away from the court. Her focus never drifted toward the crowd. From the very first point, the intensity was unmistakable. Eala opened with a wide serve that forced a difficult return, and the roar that followed echoed through center court as though championship point had already arrived. It was far too early, and far too loud. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the fairy tale would simply continue writing itself. Then the match changed. Only a couple of games later, Eala missed a routine forehand that she would normally make without hesitation. Paulini capitalized immediately, holding serve with clinical efficiency before doing it again. Almost without anyone noticing the precise moment it happened, the contest transformed. This was no longer a celebration. It became a fight. Momentum shifted constantly, almost impossible to predict. Eala continued winning the crowd, but Paulini was beginning to win the scoreboard. That difference, between emotional energy and actual points, often determines matches at this level. One rally stretched beyond 10 shots, each player refusing to surrender an inch. Then Eala fired a return that clipped the sideline and died before Paulini could reach it. Break point. Eala stepped inside the baseline, inviting a second serve. Paulini accepted the challenge. One bold return later, the ball flew past her before she could react. The break belonged to Eala. For another brief moment, it felt as though the magic would continue. But champions rarely panic. Paulini responded immediately, breaking straight back with remarkable composure. Her expression barely changed. She looked calm, almost detached, the kind of calm that only comes from surviving pressure on the biggest stages before. Even the commentators fell silent. Not because nothing was happening, but because everyone inside center court suddenly realized they were watching a very different match than the one they had expected. The rallies grew longer. 10 shots. 12 shots. Then 15. Every point became a battle of patience, precision, and nerve, with neither player willing to give away even the smallest advantage. Neither player was willing to be the first to show fatigue. Serving to stay level in the opening set, Eala found herself locked in another exhausting rally. Shot after shot came back with relentless precision until, on a ball she would normally chase down without hesitation, she made a rare mistake. Break point. Her serve missed its target by only a few inches. Paulini's didn't. That tiny margin proved to be the difference. The break belonged to the Italian. Eala responded with nothing more than a quiet smile and a slight nod toward herself rather than her player's box. It was the expression of someone reminding herself that the match was far from over. Paulini, however, showed exactly why she had reached a Wimbledon final before. She didn't simply protect her advantage, she expanded it. Point by point, she closed the door with remarkable composure, taking the opening set 6-4 in a performance that somehow made the chaos of the previous games appear effortless, even though every point had demanded absolute precision. During the changeover, Eala sat silently studying the strings of her racket, almost as if the solution might somehow reveal itself there. For the first time in the tournament, center court found itself asking a genuine question. Was this where the dream finally ended? Eala didn't know it then, but the next few games would completely change that conversation. There was one important detail many people inside the stadium had already forgotten. Earlier in the tournament, in a match that received far less attention than her stunning victory over Iga Swiatek, Eala had already recovered from losing the opening set. That comeback had disappeared beneath the headlines generated by her biggest upset, but her coaching team hadn't forgotten it. Neither had she. As the deciding set began, Eala looked like an entirely different competitor. She wasn't playing recklessly. She was simply playing with greater freedom. Instead of waiting behind the baseline, she began stepping forward on Paulini's second serve, taking precious time away from one of the tour's quickest players. The crowd sensed the shift almost immediately. Their confidence returned cautiously, as though they wanted to believe without tempting fate. Eala held serve to love. Just like that, the entire rhythm of the match changed. During Paulini's next service game, Eala struck 3 consecutive returns deeper than anything she had produced all afternoon. The third flew flat through the middle of the court before Paulini had even completed her split step. Deuce. Then deuce again. A fortunate net chord suddenly bounced in Eala's favor, the kind of moment that either changes a match forever or disappears without consequence. She refused to waste it. Stepping inside the baseline, she unleashed a fearless cross-court winner. Break. This time, the reaction inside center court sounded different. It wasn't pure celebration. It was relief. Thousands of spectators seemed to exhale together after holding their breath for what felt like an eternity. Even then, nothing came easily. Serving to consolidate the break, Eala quickly found herself trailing 15-30, exactly the kind of scoreline where momentum can quietly disappear. Instead, she delivered two outstanding first serves before finishing the game with a blistering forehand winner. The hold belonged to her. Somewhere in the stands, a small group of Filipino supporters, many of whom had made last-minute trips simply hoping to witness history, could barely keep their phones steady as they tried to capture the moment. Paulini refused to surrender. She continued fighting through every game, matching Eala's intensity point for point. Yet something had unmistakably changed. Eala was moving more freely. She was arriving earlier to every ball. Most importantly, she now looked completely convinced that this match was still hers to win. Serving for the set, she produced one final sequence worthy of the occasion. A wide serve forced a short return. One clean forehand into the open court finished the job. The set belonged to Alexandra Eala. The match was level once again. Somewhere high in the stands, a Philippine flag rose above the crowd, its owner nearly losing balance in the excitement as center court erupted once more. For a brief moment, it felt as though the momentum had completely shifted. But the deciding chapter was still waiting to be written. The turning point where the underdog story finishes writing itself exactly the way everyone in that stadium wanted it to. Except tennis doesn't care what you want. And the deciding set that followed felt like something else entirely. Heavier. Tighter. Every single point carrying weight that the first two sets simply hadn't. Because here's the detail nobody mentions enough. Paulini had already lived through a deciding set on this exact court. In her own run to a Wimbledon final 2 years earlier, Alex hadn't. Not at this level. Not with this much riding on every single shot. She kept swinging the same fearless way that had taken down a Grand Slam champion just days earlier. But Paulini started reading the patterns a half-step earlier now, anticipating the cross-court forehand before it even left the strings. Small adjustment. Changed absolutely everything. Midway through the set, in a service game that felt like its own separate hour stretched out across an entire stadium's held breath, Paulini finally gets the break she's been hunting since the first point of the match. Two impossible retrievals keep the game alive against all odds, and then one backhand clips the tape and falls on the wrong side. Break. And here's the part that should surprise you. Center court doesn't turn against her. It goes quiet instead. That specific quiet of thousands of people silently willing one player to find something extra, somewhere, from anywhere. For a few games, it looks like she might actually do it. She saves break points with two fearless first serves that shouldn't have landed but did. Chases down balls that should have been clean winners and somehow drags them back into play. Still smiling between points, still not done, at not yet. That should have carried this all the way to the final games of the match. It almost does. Serving at 3-4, she faces the hardest stretch of the entire 2.5 hours. Deuce. Deuce again. A rally stretching past 15 shots, both players refusing to blink, and then finally a backhand sails just long on break point. The break arrives, and with it arrives the unmistakable sense that this has reached its final stretch. Paulini serves for the match at 5-3, Alex attacks every single return, refuses to give away one free point, fights for every single inch like the scoreboard hasn't already made its decision. But Paulini has done exactly this before, on courts exactly like this one, and she closes it out the way only players who've actually reached a Wimbledon final know how to close a match like this. One clean serve, one final forehand, 6-4, 4-6, 6-3, 2.5 hours of the most gripping tennis this entire tournament produced, and it's over. Here's what you need to understand about what happens next, because it's the part almost nobody expects. She doesn't collapse, doesn't cry, walks straight to the net, shakes hands, shares a warm, genuine embrace with the woman who just ended her run, and then the entire stadium rises to its feet. Not for a champion lifting a trophy. For a 21-year-old who spent 2 weeks completely rewriting what people believed was even possible for her. She leaves London as the first player from her country to ever reach the 4th round of Wimbledon, a record that didn't exist 2 weeks earlier and now carries her name permanently. Clips of the Swiatek win were already racking up millions of views before she'd even left the grounds that evening, and footage of her fighting back to level the match against Paolini spread just as fast. Proof that somewhere in the middle of that second week, this had stopped being just a sports story. Here's the twist, the one that actually matters more than the scoreline. The scoreboard says she lost. Watch those 2.5 hours again, though, and you'll see something completely different. A player who refused to be intimidated by a legendary name across the net, who clawed back from a set-down against an opponent with real, personal motivation for revenge, who pushed a deciding set all the way to the final game while an entire country stayed up past midnight just to watch her do it. Paolini walked off finally having answered the one result that had bothered her all season, and she'd need every last bit of that composure again within days. Because a place in the quarterfinals meant another dangerous opponent, another full house, another chance for somebody else's story to try ending hers the exact same way she'd just ended this one. One door closes, another opens immediately. No time to enjoy a win. No time to mourn a loss. Her coach didn't say much afterward, just stood near the tunnel with his arms crossed, watching her walk off court. She picked up her bag, took one last look around center court. The applause still hadn't stopped, still hasn't really stopped even now if you ask anyone who was in that building. 2 weeks earlier, nobody across the net from her would have thought twice about her name. That's no longer true, and it changed in front of the entire sport, not on some forgotten outer court, but on center court itself, twice, against a defending champion and then against a former finalist, in front of cameras that had barely learned how to pronounce her name before that first Swiatek point sailed long.